When Donald Trump imposed sweeping tariffs during his first term as US president, it sparked a trade war with China. Now, as the Trump administration ratchets up its threat to tax imports from its allies and economic rivals alike, the world is bracing for another wave of economic disruption.
There are growing fears of a major global trade war tonight after President Trump announced sweeping tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China.
Donald Trump says he has issued his first tariff on Colombia after 2 U.S. deportations.
We'll take you straight to the White House. The President of the United States announcing new trade tariffs against China.
This protectionist shift is all the more remarkable given the way the US has championed trade liberalisation for much of the past 50 years. So what does it actually take for a country to use protectionism to grow its economy? Some developing countries have successfully used tariffs to do so, while others have struggled. In this episode, we talk to an economist about who wins and who loses from tariffs and protectionism. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. With me on the show today, I have Tracy Walsh, economy and business editor at The Conversation in the US, based in New York. Tracy, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Tracy, you've been following the conversation around tariffs very closely in these first few weeks of Trump's second presidential term. What's been happening?
So during his campaign, Trump made some pretty big promises on this issue, including that he would impose a 10% tariff sort of across the board on all imports, and also a 60% tariff on Chinese products specifically. Now that he's back in office, we've seen a lot of threats, but no action really on that scale so far. So what's happened so far? Not long after his inauguration, Trump made some pretty big headlines by proposing 25% tariffs on Colombia, but he backed down pretty quickly after there were some negotiations. Then, not long after that, in early February, he announced 25% tariffs again on Mexico and Canada. But after he spoke with those two countries' leaders, he delayed those tariffs until March, and some people are skeptical that they'll ever go into effect. He did follow through with a threat to impose 10% tariffs on Chinese goods. That happened in early February. More recently, he's announced 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, which are supposed to take effect in mid-March. And he's also ordered his team to prepare a plan for reciprocal tariffs by April. But again, he's backed down on these threats before, so the situation remains fluid.
And how are they responding then to the threats of tariffs being imposed on imports with what was essentially their ally until a few weeks ago?
We've already seen a lot of pushback from key trading partners. China's imposed counter tariffs on U.S. coal, liquefied natural gas, crude oil, cars, farm machinery, and they've imposed other sort of retaliatory measures. Canada, Mexico, and the EU, all have closer relationships with the U.S., but they've still warned that they're willing to retaliate, and they're going to retaliate if new tariffs go into effect.
And this isn't new for the US, although there's been a wave of free trade liberalisation in the last kind of 50, 60 years. There have been moments in US history where protectionism and tariffs have been really the order of the day, most notably in the 1930s. What are the lessons people are talking about from that period?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most infamous examples from U.S. history is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. The idea was to protect American farmers and American industries during the Great Depression by raising tariffs on, I think it was 20,000 imported goods. But instead of helping the economy, it basically triggered retaliation from other countries, leading to a collapse in international trade, which really hurt American exporters. And the effect was basically to worsen the Great Depression. So a lot of economists today, probably the majority of them, look at Smoot-Hawley as a cautionary tale, demonstrating basically how aggressive tariff policies backfire.
And you're now talking to lots of economists at this moment about Trump's new tariffs in this new presidential term and the fact that the US is doubling down on the protectionism that the US went through in his first term. What are they saying to you about the impact that this will have both on the US economy and on global trade more generally?
The consensus is mostly negative. Most economists I'm speaking with are arguing that broad-based tariffs basically, they hurt more than they help. They increase costs for consumers and businesses. They disrupt supply chains. They can put international trade at risk. So they have risks domestically and internationally. So for the U.S., one risk is higher prices for consumers as companies pass on tariff costs. Inflation is a pretty big domestic political issue here, so that can have broader repercussions. Another risk is job losses in industries like agriculture and manufacturing that are really dependent on exports. And for the world, if a full-blown trade war erupts, that's going to be bad for everybody. We could see slower global growth as international trade slows down, and also more uncertainty in financial markets. So overall, the economists that I'm speaking with are pretty skeptical that these tariffs will deliver the benefits that Trump is promising.
Thank you, Tracy. I know you're following it all closely. We appreciate you coming on and explaining it all to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
As Tracy said, the majority of economists are deeply worried about what a new trade war has in store for the world. But in what circumstances can tariffs actually work? I've reached out for this episode to Justin Høge, an assistant professor in development studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Justin's research focuses on how developing countries build wealth and power in the global economy. When I called Justin up, I asked him what the main arguments are in favour of tariffs.
The main argument is that when you put tariffs or taxes on imports, that will in some way help domestic firms and domestic producers of those products. So by using tariffs, you can, if they are used effectively and if they're successful, help domestic firms become better at producing what they're producing and eventually become competitive in the world economy. The main argument here is you want to protect somehow the domestic economy and domestic firms. And sometimes that's successful, other times that's not successful. It can also be an effective way of raising taxes, especially for countries that don't have a lot of tax revenue, especially developing countries.
This argument is based on the idea that tariffs can make foreign products more expensive, giving an advantage to domestic producers of things like cars or steel or food. Since imported goods are now more expensive, consumers and businesses may be more likely to buy from local producers instead. This can help protect domestic industries from foreign competition. What about the opposite argument, against tariffs and in favour of free trade, or what's called trade liberalisation?
The argument against is that you might put this cushion for domestic firms that they might misuse. It also obviously hurts consumers because prices of various things become more expensive when you put taxes on imports. And that's been a big concern in recent times because of what we've seen happening with inflation in many countries. So those are some of the big concerns.
One example for this is the tariffs the first Trump administration placed on Chinese goods in 2017.
We have one particular problem, and that's China.
Some of the products that were affected were everyday items like electronics and furniture. While the tariffs were meant to protect US manufacturers, they ended up raising prices for consumers, for example, by about 12% for washing machines, according to one study. Let's do a bit of a history of tariffs here. So how have they been used as an economic tool, and when have they been most predominantly used by most countries?
Not many people are aware of this, but the most protectionist country in modern economic history, 1800s, 1900s, up until present, is the United States. They had the highest average tariff rates on imported goods throughout the 1800s. And this was because the United States at the time was trying to catch up with Great Britain.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, the UK was the world's leading industrial power. As a colonial empire, it was dominant in manufacturing and had strong global trade networks. To compete, the US turned to tariffs to grow its own economy.
One of the people who is seen as creating one of the intellectual pillars for the use of tariffs is Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the United States, the first Treasury Secretary. And he wrote this report to Congress in 1791 that outlined how the United States needed to put tariffs on imported manufacturers from Great Britain in order for the United States to build up their economy. And the United States did that throughout the 1800s. Hamilton didn't live to see that because he died very early on in a pistol duel. But yeah, throughout the 1800s, the United States was relatively successful with tariffs.
Throughout the 19th century, Justin says the US used tariffs sporadically. Then, following the Great Depression of 1929, countries including the US, Britain, France, and Germany also used protectionist measures in response to the economic crisis. Remember, this was the era of the Smoot-Hawley Act that Tosi told us about at the beginning of the episode. But over the rest of the 20th century, as a result of economic and political shifts, protectionist policies like tariffs gradually fell out of favour.
Since the 1970s and 80s, protectionism was seen more as a bad thing, especially when wealthy countries and international organizations started talking about the virtues of free trade. So if you take sort of international economics 101, you will be probably taught that barriers to trade hinder trade, and that is bad for global economic prosperity. And if all countries in the world have high protectionist barriers at the same time, that is probably true. You see some impact on trade, and trade in itself is a good thing for the world.
The problem is that not all countries benefit equally from free trade. Wealthy nations that export high-value goods like technology, pharmaceuticals, or luxury items gain more from lower protectionist measures and free trade. By contrast, countries that primarily export low-value materials like coffee, textiles, or raw minerals often find themselves at a disadvantage. That's because high-value goods have higher profit margins and are less vulnerable to price fluctuations in global commodities markets.
So when rich countries were ahead in the 1970s and the 1980s and 1990s, it made sense for them to preach the virtues of free trade to the rest of the world.
You've argued in your work that protectionist measures, including tariffs, can be useful to countries to help them grow their economies. What are some good lessons from history about when that's worked for countries?
South Korea, for example, was very poor in the 1950s, and then it very quickly shot up to high-income status, had done so by the 1990s. So it's really one of the fastest experiences of rapid economic development we witnessed throughout the history of capitalism. And especially in the 50s and 60s, South Korea used protectionist measures. You saw tariffs across the board in steel, in automotive, across manufacturing sectors. But they did it in a way to try and incentivize domestic producers to become competitive on the world market.
The South Korean government provided favours like tariffs and subsidies to firms, but only if they met performance targets, such as exporting a certain share of their goods.
They gradually went from being a low-income, low-tech economy towards becoming extremely important players in global industries like electronics and automotive and steel.
So it worked?
It worked, yeah, certainly. The protectionist measures in Korea 100% work. Now, I should be clear, these weren't only tariffs. They were tariffs sometimes mixed with a range of other protectionist measures and also measures intended for export performance. But the key takeaway about Korea is there was a state that very actively used industrial policy in a range of ways to develop its economy. And that's what history shows us. You need a state that is quite active in terms of governing the market in the right direction. And that's also what we're seeing in China. That's been such a huge success.
Another example is Taiwan, which followed a similar path in the late 1950s and 60s.
It was pretty similar to Korea in terms of developing its economy around the same time, and also similar to Korea in the sense that it focused a lot on developing its manufacturing sector and electronics industry, for example. Taiwan also had a very clever way of nudging foreign investors that came into the economy of transferring technology or going into joint ventures with domestic firms so that Taiwanese firms would learn more. Taiwan also had a huge state-owned enterprise sector, right? So quite a few smaller firms were partially or fully owned by the state. We should say that Taiwan is a bit different than Korea because Taiwan was a much larger range of smaller firms, but in Korea you saw these huge conglomerates, these huge large firms known as the chaebol.
This was the 1950s and 60s. So did South Korea and Taiwan gradually wean themselves off these tariffs in some way, or are they still quite protectionist countries now?
Not to the same degree. I mean, there are Korean scholars who have been somewhat critical about the liberalisation that's been happening in Korea since the 1990s and some economic stagnation. The state is still very important in these countries. In Taiwan, for example, you also see that Taiwan has developed into becoming an extremely important hub for semiconductor manufacturing, right? One of the largest semiconductor manufacturing companies in the world, the largest, I believe, TSMC, is Taiwanese and obviously has very close relationships with the state there.
So those are two examples of where protectionist measures in countries that were trying to grow their economies really fast worked. And economists agree with that. Are there examples of countries that tried to impose tariffs on imports and it didn't work?
Yeah. In the 50s and the 60s, the use of protectionist measures and tariffs were quite prevalent around the world. For example, in many African countries, it did not work as well. Ghana is sometimes talked about in this respect. So many firms, although they were protected with tariffs, for example, did not become competitive on the world market. So there was positive economic growth in Africa in the 50s and 60s, and also the manufacturing sector grew, but it did not grow to become internationally competitive.
When they gained independence, most African economies retained the colonial-era structure of economies focused on raw material exports. Many lacked the infrastructure, skilled workforce, and capital needed to build competitive industries that could benefit from protectionist measures in the first place.
You did see this strategy working in some countries in southern Africa, like Zimbabwe had higher growth in this period. South Africa also higher growth in its manufacturing sector. And today South Africa has a more diversified and high-tech manufacturing sector than most other African countries. But a lot of African countries encountered trade balance difficulties as a result of not generating enough exports.
In the 1970s, during a number of oil price shocks, when the price of oil soared, African countries struggled even more with their balance of trade because of the price of importing oil.
International organizations came in with liberalisation programs, like the IMF and the World Bank, known as the structural adjustment programs, which arguably made things worse.
Structural adjustment programs were economic reforms imposed by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank on developing countries in the 1980s and 90s. This happened across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. These programs required countries to reduce government debt, liberalize their economies, and adopt free market policies, often with devastating social and economic consequences.
Especially in Africa, the state was vilified by international organizations during this wave of neoliberalism. So protectionism, industrial policy, state intervention, that was more or less dismantled across the continent during the 1980s and the 1990s. Conditions centered around basically minimizing or shrinking the public sector, right? Privatization. A lot of state-owned enterprises were privatized. Minimal trade barriers, including no tariffs, no export subsidies. One thing we can say for certainty is that structural adjustment did not work. It was disastrous.
Amid all this, in 1995, the World Trade Organization emerged as the global negotiating forum for trade liberalization, reinforcing even further a move away from protectionism.
When you're a member of the World Trade Organization, which most countries in the world are today, you are technically not allowed to use things like export subsidies. And there's a drive towards really lowering countries' tariffs, because the whole rhetoric and the idea behind the mantra of the World Trade Organization is that free trade benefits the world and more trade benefits the world. So if you want to be part of the WTO, you need to liberalize. A lot of developing countries have suffered under that.
An underlying principle of the WTO's rules is that countries aren't meant to impose unequal tariffs for the same product on different members of the WTO. This is called the most favoured nation rule. So, for example, you're not meant to impose 10% tariffs on steel from one country and 30% tariffs on steel from another country. That is, unless you have a specific free trade or bilateral agreement with that country. Now, the world's very poorest countries do have some exemptions from WTO rules that give them leeway to use protectionist measures. But the world's richest countries have a lot more power in shaping trade agreements, both within and outside the WTO framework. So what's supposed to happen if a country breaks WTO rules?
So sometimes, you break a rule and it can take years before a dispute is settled and the protectionist measure could have taken an effect. If you're a small country, you might easily get away with it because it has no impact on bigger countries. If you're a bigger country and then the United States comes into and makes a case before the WTO, then that can make things worse. Now, the United States have blocked judicial appointments to the appellate body, which is where these disputes are made and settled.
In 2017, during the first Trump administration, the US refused to approve new judges, arguing that the body had overstepped its mandate. By the end of 2019, the appellate body was left without enough judges to function, paralyzing the dispute settlement system.
It means that, in effect, the dispute settlement mechanism isn't working within the WTO. Why has the United States blocked judicial appointments? to this body? Well, clearly because the WTO is no longer working in favor of the United States.
This means the WTO is effectively unable to enforce fair trade rules, particularly for smaller countries that rely on this system to resolve disputes. What you're saying is that small countries can impose tariffs and other protectionist measures, but they risk retaliation
Yes.
and economic isolation, perhaps.
Yes, very much so. And it's important to say that one way of retaliating can be going to the WTO and saying, this country did something illegal. But bilateral retaliation through other trade means can also happen. The United States can target a specific country in certain ways that is not necessarily illegal under WTO rules to specifically harm that country. And so this is why I'm saying that if you're a large and powerful economy, you can always find ways to economically retaliate and threaten the way you want. So whether or not the WTO exists or functions or not, the crucial point here remains that it's the wealthiest and most powerful countries that kind of dictate the rules of the game in practice, because they can simply say, we're going to crush you somehow through our international economic power if you don't do what we want you to do.
Justin says bigger economies with more power regularly cross these rules without consequences.
There's a lot of debates about whether or not the World Trade Organization actually functions. Essentially, we see that big countries with a lot of leverage on the international stage, the United States, countries in Europe, but also China, they're more easily able to basically do what they want in terms of trade policy, even if it defies WTO rules, because the WTO, in effect, has proven to be somewhat powerless.
We'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons. Number one is the people that have poured into our country.
It's very clear that a lot of the trade policies that the United States have implemented under Trump and then Biden again, and I will see from Trump, but a lot of lawyers would be very clear that the United States has broken WTO rules. But I don't think they really care about that. There's also these clauses under WTO law that will allow countries to use certain measures under the scope of national emergencies. And I think Trump has used this clause quite a few times. But you could also make the case that China has broken WTO rules.
The US was a key founding member of the WTO and has pushed for this trade liberalization ever since. How do you see that shift in terms of what it means for the US's position?
I'm going to be clear, it reeks of hypocrisy. And this is something I outlined in a piece that I wrote for the conversation, that I thought this reflects double standards, but it's entirely in line with, what the United States has done since the formation of the WTO for a long time. Whether or not they preach free trade to the rest of the world, or whether or not they say, oh, now we're going to be protectionist and neo-mercantilist, which is another word for protectionist. It's all about protecting the interests of US corporations and the US economy. The shift to protectionism became prominent with Trump's first presidency. Around 2017-18 is when we really started seeing it. Biden's continued it. And we know how much Trump loves the word tariffs. I should say, though, it's been, even in previous administrations, Obama and Clinton before that, and Bush, US trade policy has been about protecting US interests. But now we see it more clearly. Now, this idea of American exceptionalism, in my view, is even more prominent. And it's unapologetically America first across the political spectrum.
Many of the tariffs that have been imposed more recently have been quite explicitly aimed at undermining China.
In some sense, that is also why we're seeing this protectionist turn right now, especially in the United States, but also to some degree in Europe, because now certain countries are starting to compete, become competitive once again. In particular, if China is now challenging the economic power of the United States, especially within a lot of manufactured goods. So the United States is not turning away from this doctrine of free trade, saying actually protectionism is useful.
President Biden and his administration announced it would keep some of those tariffs and add more. There will soon be a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, taxes of 50% on Chinese solar cells, semiconductors, and
it's obviously clear when you see Joe Biden, who had a very strong agenda on climate and the green transition, levy heavy tariffs on the imports of electric vehicles and solar panels. How does that make sense? They came from China, and China is seen now as an economic rival. Biden even put export restrictions on AI chips, so these chips, semiconductor chips that are produced by the company NVIDIA, specifically to China. And this has also worried a lot of the European countries to see all these retaliatory measures, because even Europe does not go to the same extent in trying to target China as much as the United States does.
Trump's approach to tariffs since his return to office in January has already taken a different path from Biden's, though.
The main rationale is normally economic to use tariffs. Trump's use of tariff has been a tool for bargaining with states. So he's used it with especially Mexico and Canada as a way to try to bargain and up their efforts to control the border to the U.S. better.
Just hours before a trade war was set to commence, President Trump saying he'll delay 25% tariffs on Mexico.
But then he's now suspended the tariffs because Canada and Mexico apparently made the concessions that he wanted. When it comes to China, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops, because that rivalry is more strictly economic. And also with the European Union, that rivalry is strictly economic. I do think that China is going to be harder to bargain with than the European Union. China has become very powerful, and European countries are in some ways a middle power. So Trump doesn't speak to European leaders with the same respect, it seems, because he knows he can push them around.
If I were to give you blank slate, what would you do in terms of where the rules are globally on who and who can't impose tariffs?
I want a world of shared prosperity. My perspective is coming from international development, and I recognize that there are certain countries lagging behind. So from that perspective, it makes sense for me to say, okay, if there are certain trade measures that can help these countries and actually help people in these countries move out of poverty and can improve the lives of millions of people, then for me, that is what we should strive towards. So this also means creating a global governance system that's truly democratic. Now, what I mean by this, if we look at the World Trade Organization, rich countries have a lot more influence and corporations have a lot more influence, right? In the IMF, they explicitly have more influence. Larger economies get more say in the IMF. So it's about democratizing global governance. It's also about, I think, global South countries coming together to form regional agreements and regional organizations that can to some degree challenge the hegemony of these international organizations that are very much based in the global North. And we are seeing that to some degree happening already.
Thank you so much for your time and explaining some of that nuance to us.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode. You can read more articles on The Conversation, including some by Jostein Hauge about tariffs and the trade policy of the US Trump administration. We'll put a link to some further reading in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani with production assistance from Katie Flood and sound design by Michelle Macklem. Our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really helps us reach new audiences. Thanks very much for listening.
I can't imagine what that would be for. A building of that size in the middle of the fields.
I mean, every time I go to this kind of like places and I see the compound size and then imagine the number of people inside, it just still scares me.
Scam Factories is a new series from The Conversation, taking you inside Southeast Asia's brutal scamming compound, where it's estimated hundreds of thousands of people have been trapped and forced into criminality conducting online scams.
The killing is always there.
They try all kinds of corrosive maneuvers using fire extinguisher, try hit me.
The scammers, they're always one step ahead.
Scam Factories is coming soon on the Conversation Weekly podcast and is a series of articles on theconversation.com.